Today we are going to learn about the life of African Americans and Native Americans in the colonies. When I'm going through this, I want you to try to connect to what is happening currently in our society today. There's been some conflicts between races, and it's going to be important to understand that this all kind of started at the beginning of our nation's history. And that's, in my opinion, really important for understanding this whole issue at the whole that's still at the front of the newspapers today. So we have to understand that slavery began in Virginia with the tobacco planters. We already know from past videos that Virginia and the southern colonies, they needed work the most. They needed workers, and it was hard getting that labor that they needed. Still, many of these plantation owners were very greedy and wanted a lot of money. Therefore, they didn't want to pay people to help them. So slaves was kind of the easiest route. And unfortunately, slavery is not a new thing at this period in history. There had been slaves in different parts of the world for many years, and unfortunately people were used to getting slaves and having them work and treating them horribly. It was a very bad aspect of society during this time period. It's also important to understand that slavery just was not in the South during the colonial period. Slaves and slavery expanded throughout the colonies. This was a North and South affair during this time. It wasn't just the South that had slaves. Obviously, we'll learn that this is going to change a little bit, but during this time, it expanded throughout the colonies. Enslaved Africans lived in every colony, therefore. The New England colonies had slaves, the middle colonies had slaves, and the southern colonies had slaves as well. Benjamin Franklin, a name that you might have heard of before, who we'll learn about in later chapters, he even had slaves. You'll learn about maybe a lot of American history icons that had slaves during this time period. Like I said, this was unfortunately part of life. It was instilled in kind of how society worked during this time. So slavery, eventually, it's going to expand exponentially in the South, which means that it's going to expand faster in the South, and they're going to kind of have the most slaves in that region. Most of these African slaves in the colonies were brought from West Africa, and West Africa, I'll show you on a map where that is a little later. So goods such as tobacco, rum, and cloth that were kind of created in the colonies, they were actually traded for the slaves. So obviously this trade is going to, it's going to have ships, it's going to have boats, and it's going to have to cross the ocean because the Atlantic Ocean is in the middle of the colonies and West Africa. So this crossing of slaves became known as the Middle Passage, and this is going to be really important. This Middle Passage was just a horrific nightmare experience for the slaves. There was ships that were extremely crowded, so you could not even move. Sickness was very rampant. Diseases spread easily. It was, like I said, a nightmare for the passengers, and many died just traveling over to the colonies. It was a very sad experience. Unfortunately, the slave trade was profitable for these white Europeans in the colonies, which seems disgusting and horrific, but they kept doing the Middle Passage. They kept making these trades because they were making money. I mean, this was free labor. Yes, slaves had to be paid for, but other than that, you are getting a free worker, essentially, for a plantation. It was just a sickening idea to treat humans in that way. So most of these slaves were put to work in fields raising crops. They were fixed at the bottom of colonial society, as you can imagine, and it was extremely hard for them to have a better life and make a better life. Many times there was just no hope of them being freed. Sometimes they would rebel or run away to try to find a better life, but this was very, very hard for them to do. Nevertheless, they worked hard and they were profitable, like I said, for those plantation owners. Alrighty. Here is kind of a depiction, a drawing of maybe what a ship would look like on the Middle Passage. As you can see, it's going to be extremely crowded. It's going to have men, it's going to have women, it's going to have children of all ages on this ship. And their experiences are going to be very nightmarish and very horrific. Like I said, maybe they won't even be able to move. They're going to hear cries of people dying, cries of people suffering, and many of them just kind of wish that they were dead themselves. Their life is not going to get much better in the colonies. Here's a depiction of the Middle Passage. So when we talk about the Middle Passage, we're talking about kind of West Africa, which here's the continent of Africa right here. So we're talking about the western end, and it names some cities there. And the Middle Passage is the one that is going to mostly Virginia, but it wasn't just Virginia that had these slaves. We have to remember that. But many of the times the ship was coming to Virginia. As you can see, like I said, slavery was very rampant in all the world at this time, and West Africans were getting shipped to many of the new continents that were formed. And like I said, slavery was an idea that not only was an idea of the colonists, but an idea of the world at this time. When we learn about Native Americans in the colonies, we have to remember that many Native Americans died from diseases that were brought over from Europe. So the Europeans carried new diseases such as smallpox that the Native American immune systems were not used to, and 90% of the population died off from these diseases. This is going to drastically hurt the Indians living in the colonies. A large majority of Indians were also forced into slavery. This is something that's not really well known by a lot of young students, but Native Americans became slaves as well. Indian slavery actually started first, and this led directly to the African slavery that we just learned about. This is a 1730 census from South Kingston, Rhode Island. So in this city there was 935 whites, 333 African slaves, and 223 Native American slaves. So you can see how there were more African slaves, but there was also a pretty good chunk of Native American slaves as well. So Native Americans, when the Europeans came over, they had to abandon their fields and villages, and they had to live in smaller settlements to avoid capture. They did not want to become slaves, but their populations had died off, and they couldn't really fend for themselves as well as they used to. Therefore, many tribes conjoined with each other for protection. As we learned, some Native Americans taught, or were actually forced to teach, Europeans what to grow in the colonies and how to grow certain crops. So the Europeans learned directly from the Native Americans how to grow these crops that made the Europeans money. After many years, we're talking about maybe 100 years, Europeans are going to learn more how to do this themselves. So they're going to become less dependent on these American Indians. And vice versa, these American Indians are become more dependent on the Europeans and the European technology as well. They're going to be forced to trade with them. And they're also going to blend the European technology with their own culture. Some of this technology includes guns and horses. So these are the two main things that the Native Americans are going to trade with the Europeans because they eventually started to use these a lot, and they're going to become dependent on these things. So in some tribes had to maintain good relationships with the Europeans so they could have these things such as guns and horses. Because of this blending, the Indian culture is eventually going to fall apart because they become so dependent on the Europeans on the East Coast.